Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is all around the 2022 actuarial valuation. So going to cover quite a lot of different kind of areas and a few different topics, but hopefully give you a bit of an overall kind of background about what the valuation is all about. A bit more detail about what data we use, what assumptions we use, and kind of the methods we use to do all the calculations that we do as part of the valuation. Move on to the outputs, which is probably the things of most interest to you guys in terms of what the results are and what outputs you get from us. And I'll also then talk you through a kind of example of one of the results schedules, an employer results schedule, so that you can hopefully get a bit more of a better understanding as to all the different bits and bobs in the several pages of employer results schedules, and then also talk a little bit about the funding strategy statement, which is one of the very important documents to do with evaluation and to do with how employers are treated in general within the fund, both kind of from start to finish, really, when you come into the fund as an employer, while you're participating in terms of how you're treated and how your contribution rates are calculated, and then how you would actually exit the fund as well. So what I'll do is I'll go through kind of each section, and do feel free to kind of shout and interrupt me if you've got any questions, but I will have a wee kind of pause at the end of each section in case anyone's got any questions. So I'll start off with a bit of background about the valuation itself. So the valuation we do every 3 years. It's something that we, in the regulations, we have to do every 3 years. How the fund works in general, from a kind of very basic viewpoint, so kind of breaking it down to the most simple possible kind of 3 steps. The fund collects money in the way of contributions from you as employers, but also from all the members that are actively participating and actively actually earning benefits. They pay contributions in as well. Now that money gets invested, so there is actually a kind of a pot of money that the fund has. It's not in the same way as kind of the NHS scheme and other similar public sector schemes, whereby there's no actual kind of pot of money. In those situations, what happens is the contributions that come in from people contributing actually gets used to pay the benefits that are currently being paid to pensioners. In this case, in the LGPS, local government pension scheme, there's actually pots of money there that are invested, earn investment return, and the idea being that investment return, hopefully positive investment return, helps out to pay for some of the benefits. So you actually end up as employers hopefully paying less than the entire value of the benefits, because the investment return does some of the hard work for you. So the money gets invested, and then the whole point of the whole scheme in general is to pay money out to members, and by way of benefits, so mostly the pensions when they come into payment. So the things, kind of the levers, if you like, in terms of what actually pays for the benefit, are the contributions and the investment returns that are earned on those contributions when they're invested. Now, there is a kind of key funding decision in terms of how you set the contributions. It's basically, if you've got those 2 levers of you've got contributions to pay for the benefits and you've got investment returns, how much reliance do you place on the investment returns to do a lot of the hard work compared to the contributions from employers? So this chart kind of shows on the left hand side what we call the liabilities, which is basically just the value that we place on the benefits that are going to have to be paid out, and on the right hand side the assets of the fund. So the bottom left hand block here, the bottom left green block, we've labelled kind of benefits earned to date. So what we do as part of the valuation is the valuation date this time around is the 31st of March 2022. And what we say is we value all the benefits that have been earned up until that day, and we say, right, we need to place a value on those benefits, and that's the kind of that bottom left block. Now on the asset side, you've got the kind of the assets today, so the kind of blue block at the bottom there. So that's kind of how much in the way of assets do we have today to cover the benefits that have been earned up until today. And that, comparing those two, is how we arrive at what we call the funding level. So the funding level is entirely based on what benefits have been earned up until that point in time. It doesn't more pension benefits, but the funding level is purely backward looking, if you like. It says how much we earned up until now and how much assets do we have now. But obviously we have to take into account the fact that there's always new benefits being earned. So that's that kind of lighter green bar on the left hand side. So there's obviously going to be a lot of benefits earned in the future, we're anticipating. And in order to cover the cost of those benefits, we have to say, well, we're going to have some investment return on the assets that we have just now, but also on the contributions that will be coming in the future. But we also have contributions that will be coming in both from employees and from the employers themselves as well. So that kind of pink line is that kind of key funding decision as to we've got to have to strike the right balance between how much we rely on investment return to pay for the benefits and how much we rely on contributions. So why do we actually do a valuation at all? Well, the key thing is, from our perspective, is to calculate the appropriate employer contribution rates to be paid. The second thing is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we are required under the kind of the regulations and legislation to actually do a valuation every 3 years. So another good reason to do one. The third one is also a very useful one. So analysing what's actually happened over the past 3 years compared to what we assumed was going to happen over the past 3 years. And that's very useful because obviously, as I'll come to shortly, we make quite a lot of assumptions in order to try and work out, try and place a value on all the benefits that are going to be paid out in the future. Obviously, we're looking decades into the future, so there's an awful lot of assumptions we have to make. And it's very useful every 3 years to have a wee look and see what's happened in reality over the last 3 years compared to what we assumed, and then we can kind of tweak our assumptions accordingly. It's also an opportunity to review the funding strategy statement. I'll come to that a bit later on, but as I mentioned, that's quite an important document as part of the valuation. And it's also a good opportunity to do a kind of health check on how solvent the fund is. So what is that kind of funding level looking like in terms of how much in the way of benefits has been earned up until now compared to how much money we have now. So it's very much a kind of risk management exercise for the fund. So how do we actually do the valuation? Well, on the left hand side here, we've got the inputs, if you like. So we we receive data for each member from LPPA, who you've probably heard from before. So we receive thousands and thousands of membership kind of rows of data for each member that we use as the kind of starting point. Really, it's the building block of the valuation. So obviously, without that data, we can't do any of our calculations. We can't work out how much people are going to get in pension benefits and so on. And so it's very important that that data is as accurate as possible. So as I mentioned earlier, we also need to make a lot of assumptions. So we make both financial assumptions. So that's things like how much investment return we think we're going to earn on the money we have. And also inflation assumptions, and another financial assumption, which is one of the very important ones, certainly at the moment. You'll be aware that inflation's very high at the moment, and so we have to kind of make assumptions about how that will pan out into the future. But we also have to make what we call demographic assumptions. Now, the most impactful demographic assumption that we make is the life expectancy assumption. So obviously, if we're paying out, the fund's paying out kind of pensions to members going on kind of decades into the future, we have to kind of make assumptions about how long people are going to live and how long those benefits are going to be paid for. We have to also consider the kind of the funding strategy and the investment strategy of the fund. So when we're, for example, thinking of trying to come up with the right assumption for investment return, that's obviously depends a lot on what the fund's actually invested in, and the fund invests in a kind of quite a range of different asset classes, and so we have to take that all into account when we're trying to work out an appropriate investment return assumption. And of course, we have to actually take into account the LGPS benefit structure. So how are members' benefits going to be calculated before they come into payment? So we obviously have to take that all into account as well. Now in the middle there, we've got the kind of calculation process, if you like. So me and the team kind of churn through the factory all the numbers. And then out the other end, we have the kind of outputs that we give to you guys in the fund. So the one top right there in the output section, the individual employer results schedule. So hopefully most of you received your employer results schedule already. There are some that still haven't gone out. There's still the ones that haven't gone out are essentially largely because there's kind of further data queries that we're kind of just trying to get through and make sure we're happy with the data and that it's all correct before we issue the results. But hopefully most of you received your results schedules. And as I said, I'll go through a kind of example of one towards the end of the call that will hopefully give you a bit of a better idea of what each of the individual parts of it are talking about. There is an updated funding strategy statement, as I mentioned. I'll come to that again later on. And then there will be a final valuation report, which will be finalised in March this year, which is basically a kind of overview of the whole fund position, and also has details of what each individual employer will pay going forward in terms of the contribution rates, and has a bit more background about the assumptions and how they were arrived at and the process that's been gone through. So it's a kind of document of record which will be publicly available at that point in time. Now I've put in the valuation timetable here. The work on the valuation starts kind of well in advance of the actual valuation date. So I mentioned earlier the valuation date, so the kind of effective date that we're doing all the calculations at is the 31st of March 2022. But we do a lot of work in advance of that, kind of planning the process, doing making sure there's data cleansing going on, and then there's various different parts of the process that are highlighted on this slide. I won't go through each one, but kind of throughout the year, there's been a lot of work going on by officers, by LPPA, by ourselves, trying to make sure we get in a position where we're and all the individual employer contribution rates have to all be signed off by the end of March this year. So it's quite a long process and various different bits and bobs that go on throughout the year. Has anyone got any questions on the kind of the background and how we do the valuation before we go into a bit more detail? Nope, I'm not seeing any hands up or anything, so I'll crack on. There will be, I think there'll be time at the end anyway if anyone's got if anyone thinks of anything as we go through. So to go into a bit more kind of depth on the kind of the inputs, the data and the assumptions that we use, and indeed the methodology to arrive at your contribution rates. This slide has a kind of membership summary showing the kind of difference between the last valuation, which was in 2019, compared to this valuation at 2022. And this is at whole fund level. So this is the entire fund. What you'll get is in your individual employer's results schedule, you'll get a kind of table that has kind of similar stats in it, just for you as an individual employer. But at whole fund level, on the left-hand side there, we've got kind of number of members. So it's the green bits on the bottom left here are employee members. So that's people who are actively contributing and actively earning benefits. And the number of those has gone up a bit. The blue parts of those chart that chart is what we call deferred members. So that's people who have earned benefits within the fund, but are no longer working for the employer they were earning the benefits under. So they've maybe left employment, gone to work somewhere else, but they've not actually started drawing their benefits yet. So they're perhaps not of retirement age yet, and so they still have that benefit entitlement, but it's not come into payment yet. And then the kind of orange bars at the top there, that's the current pensioner members. So that's people who are already drawing their pensions, they're already taking their pension. So all those bars have gone up a bit in terms of numbers, and that's not unusual. It's quite typical in terms of membership movements in the local government pension scheme. So that's fairly typical in terms of what we see across the board. Now on the right hand side, there's the bars on the right hand side represent, they're looking at the green parts are looking at the payroll. So that's basically all the active members, those kind of 36,000 odd active members. That's their total payroll altogether is kind of £648 million on the right hand side there at the valuation date, which again is a bit higher than it was at the last valuation. You would kind of assume that in terms of there's always new people coming in, so there's always new active members joining, and you also you expect kind of you expect salaries to increase in general and over a period of time with inflation and so on, and people being promoted. So that's again a fairly typical movement in payroll. And similarly, the pensions in payment has gone up a bit since the last valuation. So that's the pensioners that are currently getting their pensions has gone up a bit of a chunk as well. Again, you expect that from kind of new people retiring, but also kind of inflationary increases that get applied to pensions as well. So fairly typical kind of data movements since the last valuation. Now, I mentioned earlier about assumptions. We obviously have to make an awful lot of assumptions. It's a kind of key part of the process from our perspective, because we are looking decades into the future. So we're saying there are people in the scheme just now that are kind of 20 years old. They're not going to retire for another 45, 50 years. And we have to try and project what their pension benefit is going to be. So the idea of this chart is to show basically almost kind of like what one member's journey might look like from the valuation date. So we've got the valuation date on the left hand side there. There'll be contributions and investment returns kind of earned between the valuation date and this person retiring. At retirement, which is one assumption, kind of one of the assumptions we have to make is when the member will retire. So they may retire in normal health, at normal pensionable age, but they may retire in ill health early. They might retire for other reasons earlier than their normal retirement age. So we have to kind of make an assumption about how often somebody would retire at their normal retirement age or earlier or even later. When they actually retire, they have the option of taking a lump sum. So that lump sum amount can differ. The members get a chance to kind of give up some of their pension for an additional lump sum. So we have to make an assumption about how much they'll take as a lump sum. And that and the member's pension at retirement relies partly on kind of how their salary has changed over time, and also depends on what inflation has been up until that point of retirement as well, because their benefits are both linked to salary increases if they've got kind of pre-2014 benefits, but also since 2014 have been linked to inflation, because it's the care revaluation. So that's career average, the career average part of the scheme that started in 2014, that revalues with inflation over time. So we have to make assumptions about that as well. When the pension comes into payment, it increases each year with CPI inflation. So we have to make an assumption around what that might be in the future. And also, obviously, we have to make an assumption about how long the pension will be paid for. So we have to look at life expectancy as well. Now, when the person does pass away, there may well be a dependents pension that's payable. So we have to say, well, how often is it likely that there will be a dependent at that point in time? Expectancy and indeed inflation applying to that dependence pension. So there's quite a lot of assumptions there. And that's part of the reason that we do this analysis every 3 years, is to kind of try and judge how well or not so well we have done in terms of making assumptions about what might happen. So it's a kind of iterative process every 3 years that we look at to try and make sure we're getting the most appropriate assumptions. Now, in terms of the assumptions we've made this time around, there's not really any significant changes except for kind of what we're assuming inflation might be going forward. So this next chart kind of shows you that the green dotted line is what was expected at March 2019 in terms of how inflation might pan out over 20 years. And the blue line is kind of what that looks like more at this point in time at 2022. So as you'll probably be aware, inflation is very high at the moment in historic kind of norms. And so that blue line starts off pretty high. That's kind of immediate kind of inflation being quite high, but we do anticipate it over the next 20 years kind of tailing back down towards the Bank of England target of about 2% per annum. And so what we have is a curve that's a bit higher initially in the shorter term, but then tailing back to what we kind of expected longer term towards the 20-year period. So the valuation results allow for that kind of current high inflation, but assuming it'll kind of tail off back to what we generally expect in the longer term. Now, a bit more on life expectancy. There's two different parts to the life expectancy assumption. There's what we call the baseline life expectancy, which is based on what we see now in terms of people's life expectancy in data that we use to make those kind of judgments. And there's also what we call future improvements. So we make an assumption about how longevity, how life expectancy will improve going into the future. Obviously, you'll probably be aware over the last kind of 50, 60, 70 years, life expectancy has improved dramatically across the globe and indeed specifically in the UK. So we have to kind of try and make assumptions about how that might change in the future. Now, we partner with a company called Club Vita, and they have millions of lives of data, if you like, lives of pension membership data at their disposal that they gather from pension schemes. So it's not just LGPS pension funds, although they do have the vast majority of the LGPS fund data, but also private sector pension data as well that helps to kind of give an idea or extract the information on what kind of current life expectancy looks like for pension scheme members across the UK. And what they do is they look at gender, they look at pay and pension amounts, they look at postcode, and they look at kind of the reason that somebody's retired. And those are 4 good kind of indicators of life expectancy or have been traditionally. So that's kind of 4 elements they look at to come up with an appropriate assumption that's kind of specific for your membership. So when we get to going through the sample employer results schedule, there's a bit in it that has kind of your specific group of members and what their life expectancy is that we've used as an assumption. So we'll talk about that a bit later. What we have done within that analysis that Club Vita do, they have seen kind of COVID experience in terms of people's life expectancies, and that's taken a hit, obviously. What we've done is, because there's so much uncertainty about how that might pan out in the future and whether there'll be that'll be an ongoing thing or whether there'll be a kind of bounce back from that. What we've done for the assumptions for life expectancy is to basically ignore the kind of COVID years, if you like, and just say use an assumption that's more appropriate to the other years in the recent past. So there is a kind of slide at the end that I'll show you that has a kind of life expectancy heat map, if you like, of Hertfordshire that might be tends to be quite an interesting thing for people to look at, to see which parts of their particular area are kind of generally have higher life expectancies or lower life expectancies. So I'll show you that later on. So that's kind of the background about the assumptions themselves. How do we then kind of set an appropriate strategy for each employer? Well, we use 3 different parameters really. So for each employer, kind of underneath the bonnet, we set an appropriate funding target, an appropriate time horizon, and an appropriate likelihood of success. So I'll start with the first one. So funding target is generally speaking kind of how much money the fund thinks each employer needs to, well, each employer needs to basically back the benefits of their employees. And that can vary because in different circumstances, different employers will have different funding targets. So for example, the councils are kind of in the fund on an ongoing basis, expected to be kind of in the fund for decades to come. So they are treated on what's called the ongoing funding target. But there may be admission bodies such as kind of often kind of charities or what's called community admission bodies, basically employers with a community of interest with an area, and those bodies tend to be treated on what we call a low risk exit basis, unless they have a kind of guarantor that's kind of backing them within the fund. So that they'll have a slightly different funding target, because when they reach the point of ceasing participation in the fund, they will be valued on a slightly different basis from an ongoing. Now, time horizon is as I mentioned earlier, using the councils as an example, we expect then the councils to be in the fund for decades to come. But there are also quite a lot of employers that are kind of individual kind of contractors. So where things like catering services or cleaning services have been outsourced, there can be a contractor that comes in for say 3-5 years, so a much shorter period of time that they'll be in the fund. And so what we have to do is make sure there's an appropriate time horizon used for each employer to make sure that we're looking at the calculations over an appropriate time period. And then likelihood of success, what we do when we do the modelling to work out a contribution rate for an employer is we project 5,000 different possible scenarios of how the funding level might go into the future. And we look at the end of the time horizon, so say it was 5 years for a contractor, we look in 5 years' time and say, of those 5,000 projections, how many of them are fully funded or better at that point in time? And so the likelihood of success is basically a measure that says how confident do we want to be that the employer is fully funded at the end of their time horizon. So each individual employer will have a kind of likelihood of success associated with them too. So basically part of the idea of this slide is to give you the background that each employer is looked at kind of individually, has their own kind of strategy set that's most appropriate for them, and importantly, most important is that the fund is kind of managing the risk of each employer by looking at these different elements. And I think the final thing in this section is McLeod, which you've probably heard of before if you've been on any of these calls, because it's been kind of talked about for the last 5 years or so. McLeod, just as a bit of background if you haven't heard of it, is basically a case that was brought about age discrimination, really, in the sense that the benefits in public sector pension funds changed around about 2014 for some of the schemes, about 2015 for others. They moved away from final salary pension, so pension benefits that were based purely on your final salary when you got to retirement, and moved towards that career average revalued earnings, that CARE benefits that I mentioned earlier, changed over to them for the LGPS. That was in 2014. Now, those members who were kind of close to retirement at that point in time were given kind of protection basically from that change. So those members who were within 10 years of retirement when the change happened were essentially given the kind of the better of the two benefits, whichever was going to be better for them. The idea being that it wasn't kind of harmful for their pension benefits because the change was being made relatively close to when they were retiring. However, there was a challenge to that because, as you might imagine, under age discrimination, people who weren't in that kind of protected bracket of being 10 years to retirement said, well, that's not very fair. Right? Why are we not being protected as well? So that challenge was successful in the courts, and the government is now kind of busy trying to implement a kind of fix for this basically across all the public sector pension schemes. But what it means for you guys is that essentially there may be a slight increase in some of the benefits for some of the members, because the court cases, well, the remedy to it all is basically that now everybody who was affected by that gets the better of the two kind of types of benefit that they could have had over that period. So it'll be, the impact will vary by employer because it depends how many of your members are actually impacted by this and how many aren't. So if you have more people that are actually impacted, then the increase in the benefits and therefore the increase in the cost of those benefits will be a bit higher, and kind of conversely, that's the opposite would be true. Having done some estimates, so we have allowed for this McLeod impact within the valuation this time around, within the liability figures. We've made an estimate because generally speaking, the funds across England and Wales don't have all this data yet to be able to actually figure out the exact consequences, but we've made estimates, and now across the whole of the fund, it's a pretty small impact in terms of the increase in cost. It's about 0.1% of the liabilities. But as I said, that'll vary by employer. So across the whole fund, it's about 0.1% of liabilities, but an individual employer might see kind of 0.5%, 1% increase, and another employer might see no impact at all. So it will vary by employer, but largely, generally speaking, we're not anticipating a big impact across the board. But that has been built in this time around to the liability calculations. Has anyone got any questions about all that? I'm conscious it's quite a kind of technical extravaganza of a few slides, but if anyone's got any questions at this point, happy to answer them. If not, I can talk a bit more about the results themselves. Not seeing any hands, so I'll carry on. So at whole fund level, this slide shows kind of the whole fund results, the initial whole fund results. We've done, what we do is we do kind of look at the whole fund in general to start off with, and then once we start drilling down into individual employer positions thereafter, some of the data tends to change a little bit. So these are the initial results at whole fund level, and so they may change slightly before the final results are published in March. But in general, we don't anticipate the position changing dramatically, and so this is kind of the general theme in terms of movement at whole fund level. So at the last valuation, 2019, the fund was about 98% funded, so slightly in deficit. And this valuation, it's looking more like being a little bit in surplus, so about 106% funded. One thing I would say, or a couple of things, is, as I mentioned earlier, this is like kind of looking at the past service. This is purely the benefits that have been earned up until the valuation date, ignoring kind of anything that is earned thereafter, and we're just saying how much do we think the value of those benefits is compared to the value of the value of the assets that we have just now, the kind of the pot of money we have. And it's also important to note that this is just looking at it on that particular day. Now, it does fluctuate, and it fluctuates on a daily basis. So you can be 106% funded one day, you can be 112 the next, 100 the day after that. So it does vary quite a bit, and a lot of that is because it's all related to market conditions on a particular day. And so your asset figure obviously will move around daily based on how the assets are valued on any given day, but also the value we place in the liabilities, because things like inflation expectations move quite regularly as well, as do kind of assumptions about how much we might earn in investment returns. So it is a kind of moving feast, but for the purposes of doing a valuation, we have to kind of do it on that particular day and say that's what the figure is. It will, so in general, we've seen an improvement in the funding level across at whole fund level, but that will vary underneath the bonnet, if you like. So that kind of whole fund position is the aggregation of every employer underneath. But you will see some employers who have seen a drop in their funding level, and you'll see some who have had a bigger improvement than is shown there. And obviously that aggregate position is just saying you've gone from 98% to 106%, but there will be some employers who have dropped and some who have risen by a greater amount than that. So it's just to kind of have that in the back of your mind, that just because the whole fund position has improved, it doesn't mean necessarily you as an employer, your individual position has done exactly the same thing. So this next slide, I'm not going to go through in a massive amount of detail, but if there's any kind of accountants on the line, they might appreciate this as a kind of breakdown, a reconciliation of the whole funding level from last time to what it is this time around at the bottom right. So it's basically trying to break down kind of all the different impacts that we've seen over the last 3 years. I've kind of highlighted in green a couple of elements. So the top one there, higher than expected investment returns. There has been much better investment returns over the last 3 years than we generally expected. And the other green element there is kind of something that's counteracting sheet, is the impact of how we think inflation might go into the future. So that's what I was mentioning earlier about our assumptions about inflation are a bit higher than they were at the last valuation because of the kind of current environment being quite a bit higher than we expected. So that kind of acts in the other direction. So those two things are really the key drivers of what's happening at this valuation. But as I mentioned, so that was all at kind of whole fund level. But there are that's just the aggregate of all the individual employers underneath the bonnet, if you like. So these two charts show you a kind of idea of the variability that sits underneath that aggregate position. So on the right hand side, I'll start with the chart on the right. All those blue dots are different employers underneath the bonnet, if you like. That pink line is the kind of whole funding level, and all the blue dots are all the individual employers underneath the bonnet. So you'll see that generally speaking, the higher the asset share, so the asset share is the kind of horizontal axis here. So that's showing how much in terms of assets an employer has, and the higher that share, the more influence it has obviously on the kind of the aggregate position of the fund. And so the ones across the right there tend to be the councils who have the vast majority of the liabilities and the assets, and so they obviously tend a bit more towards the whole funding position. But as you can see, there's a mass of employers in general that have a very big range in funding levels. So you've got kind of ones down to kind of somewhere in the 50s, and you've got ones way up at kind of 190%. So a vast array of different employer funding levels underneath the bonnet. So just because the whole fund's 106% funded, by no means means that on your schedule you'll see 106% funded. On the left-hand side, just gives you a kind of idea of the different kind of profile of the employers underneath the bonnet. So you've got the councils on the left-hand side there, which show the kind of green is the number of active members, or rather the percentage of active members. So they've got about 62% of the active membership by the look of it, of the whole fund. And about 68% or something of the overall liabilities, but there are much fewer of them. So the kind of the amber or orange bar there is very low for the councils because there's far fewer councils than there are kind of other types of employer in the fund, but they have the vast majority of the liabilities. Across the other side, kind of other end of the extreme, the admission bodies. So that's quite often kind of contractors, like I said earlier, kind of outsourced cleaning or catering contracts from schools and so on, and can be charities as well. And in terms of numbers, so that's the orange bar. That's why the orange bar is quite high. So the fund, but they have a much lower liability and a much lower number of people involved. Quite often, a lot of these contracts can be just a handful of people, and so you've got much fewer members, but much more in terms of numbers of employers in the fund. And then you've got ones in between, kind of there's other scheduled bodies, there's academies, colleges and universities and so on that sit in the middle there. So it all gives you an idea of why we need to look at each kind of group individually and say we need to make sure there's an appropriate strategy for each employer, because the whole fund is quite diverse. There's a few other factors I'll note here that might cause diversity in the results. So the funding profile, so how much past service liability you have with your members compared to what the future service element of it might be. Individual member experience. So if your members have been given higher salary increases than average or than another employer, or you've had kind of an ill health early retirement, these kind of specific member experiences can have a bigger impact on you as an employer compared to another employer that hasn't had those same experience items. Membership profile, so how old your members are compared to another employer, or whether they're mostly male, mostly female, can impact on the contribution rate, because basically the older a member is, i.e. the closer they are to retirement, the more expensive their benefits are, because you've got less time to kind of earn investment return before you have to start paying money out to them. And also the contributions that have been paid since the last valuation. So the more contributions you've been paying in, the better your funding level will be, compared to the kind of vice versa, if you like. If you've not been paying in an awful lot of contributions, then your funding level will not have improved by as much as a kind of comparable employer. So no two employers are the same, which is why we kind of look at each individual employer individually. Has anyone got any question on that before? I think the next section is actually kind of taking you through a kind of sample results report, just to give you an idea of the individual bits that appear on there and what they're about. But has anyone got any questions before I do that? Oh, there's a question. Oh, and another. Oh no, it's the same one. Yep, Mr. Parker, is it?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So that scattergram of employee funding levels was quite interesting, with a variation between 50% and 190%, which is quite a big variation. Maybe you're going on to explain this, but does that lead to a variation in the contribution that the employer is requested to pay to the fund? And can you give a hint as to what that figure varies between?
Yeah, short answer is yes, it does, and that's kind of the main reason that we look at each individual employer and their own funding level is to make sure that they're paying an appropriate amount to get to that 100%. So yes, if an employer is kind of 55% funded, then they'll be asked to pay a very high contribution rate compared to somebody who's 190% funded, who there's a good chance may be asked just to pay nothing for 3 years and see how that turns out for the next 3 years. So there is quite a contrast. There will be employers who pay nothing if they've got a very short time horizon and a very high funding level, and there'll be employers that are paying kind of I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a good chance there's employers that are paying 50% of payroll, 60% of payroll if they're in a very bad funding position to try and plug that gap, basically.
Okay, and is that, I'm imagining, but perhaps you just confirm, that funding level is calculated for each employer based on this figure where they are on the scattergram, but also the various other considerations that you have outlined earlier in your presentation. Is that correct?
So the funding level is basically looks at the funding target and says, are you an ongoing employer, or are you kind of likely to cease on a different basis, and says, right, what is the value of your benefits compared to the assets. When we look at the contribution rates, we kind of project forward and we say how likely do we want to, so that's where the kind of the likelihood of success and the time horizon comes in, because we say how likely are you to be 100% funded in 5 years time, 10 years time, whatever it is. So that's when those kind of elements of the calculation come in.
Okay. I promise this will be the last follow-up. Absolutely promise. Okay, all right. And so then for any given employer, if they want to, are they able to see those calculations, or is that, you know, so deep in the computer that it's completely invisible?
Yeah, it's not really possible to see the contribution rate calculation because, as I say, it's 5,000 projections of what might happen in the future. It's not something that's particularly easy to show. But what we do show you, and I'll show you when we go through the schedule, we show you what kind of parameters we've used, and we show you what the kind of the results are and the data that's held behind it that's been used and so on. So you do get that kind of backing information, and the kind of what funding target we've used, what likelihood of success we've used, and so on. So you'll get that, but realistically being able to show you the calculation, because it's 5,000 different scenarios being projected, how many years into the future is not really kind of feasible.
Thank you.
Okay, grand. Any more questions before I move on? Don't see any more, so I'll crack on. So yeah, I think this is second last section. So I'll spend a bit of time on this because it's quite important so you can understand what the various bits of your results schedule are talking about. I think there's like 6 or 7 pages of your results, but the kind of headline figures tend to be on page 1, which you'll be happy about. So the contribution rates is probably the thing you're most interested in. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this table, which is the first table that appears in your results schedule. So there's 4 rows in it. The first row, the one that says 31st of March 2023, that row basically tells you what your current contribution rate in payment is this year for the period up until 31st of March this year. So that's typically what you've been paying over the last year. The 3 rows after it are basically saying this is what you're going to be asked to pay for the next 3 years. And so you'll see those split into what we call primary, secondary, and total. Now, primary and secondary, we under the regulations we have to call them that, but what I'll try and do is explain what they actually are. So the primary contribution rate is essentially the estimated cost of the future benefits that are being earned. Now, that'll be the vast majority of what you're paying for. So vast majority of your contribution rate is likely to be this primary rate. So that's the cost of the benefits that are being earned going forward. So ignoring what's happened in the past, just saying how much does it cost for the next year of benefits of the active members that we've got. So the secondary amount is basically a kind of an adjustment to that to make sure that we've got enough benefits, enough assets overall to cover all the benefits, so the past ones and the future ones. And so you add those two together and you get to the total on the right hand side. Now, some employers will have just a percentage of secondary amount, a percentage of pay element for that secondary amount. Some will have it expressed as a pound amount. So it might be, instead of being 2% of pay, it might say £10,000, and that will vary by employer. But typically they'll be specified within your, but some are a percentage of pay, some are a pound amount. Underneath the table, there's a little bit of extra information about kind of the administration expenses amount that's included, but also your employees, your average employees contribution rate. So what we do is we look at each employer and your specific employees, and as you're probably aware, the percentage of pay that an employee has to pay into the fund is set out in the regulations, so it can't be changed. It's not recalculated every 3 years. It's just within the regulations, and it depends on what their pay is. So basically, kind of the higher you get paid, basically the higher percentage of your pay you pay in to the fund as an employee. So what we do there is we work out what average percentage your employees are paying and give you that for a bit of extra information. So that's contribution rates themselves. That's the first table you see in the results schedule. But another table that's on that page gives you kind of the information on how you've been treated as an employer and what those parameters were from earlier on that I was talking about, the kind of the funding target, the time horizon, and the likelihood of achieving that funding target by the end of the time horizon. So it gives you all that information there, which is specific to you as an employer. Also gives you an idea of the investment strategy that you as an employer invested in. Now the fund basically everyone's invested in the same strategy at the moment. If you're an active employer, so it will just say whole fund or something similar, main fund. I can't remember which one it is, but it will say something like that because there's only one investment strategy for active employers just now. It'll also say whether you are open or closed to new entrants. So generally speaking, well, you'll either be classed as open or closed to new entrants. So that just basically means, are you bringing new active employees into the LGPS or are you not? And the reason that is kind of differentiated between is because basically if you're not bringing new members in, then obviously your membership will get smaller and smaller, your payroll will get smaller and smaller, and so we have to make sure we take that into account when we're doing the calculations. So there's another question there. I just noticed. I'm not sure how long you've had your hand up, but happy to answer your question if you've still got one, Mr. Parker.
Yeah, it's me again, I'm afraid. Yeah. Obviously, these are key assumptions in this table. If they're wrong, can you query them, or was there an opportunity earlier to query them, which I have to remember I don't recall, which I have to say I don't recall. Or can you? And if you can't query them, then can you get them corrected in for the 3-year valuation in 3 years' time?
You absolutely can query them if you think they're wrong in some way. Then do speak to officers and let us know, because if they're not correct, then and the things you would normally probably or potentially need change might be the funding time horizon. If you're aware that you're going to be, for example, if you've got a 10-year contract and we've calculated based on a 5-year contract, then yes, clearly that's something that we would want kind of to correct and make sure that everybody's kind of systems are up to date, knowing the appropriate time horizon, for example. So yes, if you get this and you think that any of that is wrong, then do please get in touch with officers.
Thank you.
Great. Right, I'm conscious of time here, given we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll kind of try and whiz through a little bit. So next table we're talking about is page 2, which has the funding level. So this will be the funding level specific to you as an employer. Again, it's a kind of snapshot at that one particular date. Doesn't include future benefits. It's just saying what has been earned up until now. It will differ from what you disclose in your accounts. If you disclose kind of FRS 102 or IAS 19 pension figures, it will differ from those because those are very much kind of the assumptions we have to use for FRS and for IAS are very prescribed and aren't kind of fund specific. So they will differ from that. And if you're in a pool, it'll show the pool's total funding position, not use an individual employer underneath. So it kind of shows you a breakdown of kind of employee liabilities, deferred member liabilities, and current pensioners as well. Page 3 gives you a lot more detail about the assumptions that have been used, so kind of investment return, salary increases, and benefit increases. The middle table there is very technical. I do not expect anybody, any employers, to understand that just by looking at it. It's there actually specifically in case you get kind of separate advice from another advisor, so that they can see exactly how the life expectancy assumptions have been arrived at. The table at the bottom is maybe slightly more kind of useful or kind of readable, in the sense that it gives you the average life expectancy from age 65 that we've used for your particular organisation's membership profile. So that does vary by employer because it's specific to your membership. As I mentioned earlier, there is a membership data summary also included on page 4 of your results schedule. So again, similar to discussions we just had, if anything within that looks wrong to you, so for example, if it shows you've got 20 active members and you think you've got 120, then do let officers know, and similarly for kind of some of the other figures there that you might think that doesn't look right, do let us know so we can make sure we're using the right data for your calculations, because that is, as it says there, the kind of the foundation of your results is the data that we get and the data that we use to start off with. Page 5 has a kind of fairly detailed reconciliation in a similar way to I showed earlier for the whole fund level. Shows you kind of the various impacts over the last 3 years of things on both the asset side of your funding level and on the liability side. So that can be quite interesting as well. So in summary, the valuation itself, funding position as a whole fund has improved, but that may vary by individual employer. The reasons for the change is that basically there's been really good investment returns over the last 3 years, but that higher kind of future expectation of inflation means that's had a kind of impact in the opposite direction. In terms of contribution rates, there's probably a bit of upward pressure on rates for future benefits because of that higher future inflation expectation, but perhaps operating slightly in the opposite direction are the good funding levels now, better funding levels in general now compared to 3 years ago, mean that perhaps overall it could go one way or the other. You may end up paying slightly more contributions than last time if it's more, your rate is more impacted by kind of future cost of benefits, or it might go, you might pay slightly less if it's more past service that's affected. So that's all I was going to talk about on that. There is a slide on funding strategy statement. I'll just check how many slides. I think it's just one slide, so I'll just go through this quickly. So the funding strategy statement is a kind of document that sets out how you're treated as an employer within the fund. There's no real material changes in the funding strategy in terms of how we've treated employers this time. But what we have done is we've tried to use it as an opportunity to cut down a lot of the wording that's not necessarily kind of, well, we've tried to kind of distill it down a bit more, so that I think it was about 50 to 60 pages long. It's now about kind of 25 pages long, something like that. So we've distilled it down a lot better, so that it's hopefully a bit more accessible and kind of navigatable by all stakeholders, including yourselves, to have a read through. It has been sent out for consultation, so do have a read of that, and let the fund know if you get any thoughts on it as well, would be very useful. So I think that's pretty much what this says. So yeah, if you've got any questions about your results, any questions about the funding strategy statement or comments, please do get in touch with fund officers. And this was the kind of promised heat map of life expectancy in Hertfordshire, if that's of any interest to anybody. The slides will be circulated afterwards, so you will see this. You can view it at your leisure. But basically, kind of blue, the darker blue, you have the higher the life expectancy, and the kind of red or darker red, the lower the life expectancy. So it's quite often one of the most interesting to people, to most interesting charts we show for people to actually have a look at.